St. Peter's.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So the Auditor General told the PEI Public Accounts Committee on November 10th that she sent a letter to government in October outlining specific concerns she found in e-gaming. Question the Premier. Was this letter the first occurrence when you learned the Auditor's concerns of Bill Dow's conduct in being an investor in the same deal that he was providing legal services to government for?
Honourable Premier.
Yes, Mr. Speaker.
Honourable Member, Georgetown, St. Peter's.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Auditor found government's lawyer was a shareholder in a related company while acting as government's counsel in a contested business deal. Premier, do you agree with the Auditor's concerns on this matter?
Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, that's the nature of a management letter, is to raise those issues, and we're reflecting on the Auditor General's comments, and we'll have a response to the Auditor General, and we'd be happy to share that response with this House. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Premier. Honourable Member, Georgetown, St. Peter's.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. While I sat in on that committee that day, I did say to the Auditor General that I look forward to seeing what government's move will be on this, and I mean that quite sincerely. Premier, you told Islanders, and even I believed you at the time, foolish of me, suppose, but that you were going to do things differently, and this wasn't the way that you operate a government. Now we see that you're sweeping things right under the rug, and you took no action on this. This is something that I would have expected a man of your background to take immediate action on. Premier, why are there no consequences under your rule for this blatant scandal and abuse of public trust and of the public purse?
Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, there are indeed consequences. The consequences are to put in place policies, laws, to bring forward now, including in the session of this legislature, further measures to address openness and transparency. And Mr. Speaker, the consequence is that we are standing by the 15 recommendations from the Auditor General. We're implementing those, and we are committed, Mr. Speaker, to running strong, open, transparent cabinet government, and we are committing to approach any opportunity for economic development, Mr. Speaker, with the utmost diligence. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Premier. The Honourable Member, Georgetown, St. Peter's.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. So it's great to hear that the Premier believes in rules and thinks they should be followed and moving forward, and he's going to do everything to make sure. And Mr. Speaker, as the Premier well knows, the Law Society PEI has an entire code of conduct and it has a section that deals with conflict and the duty to avoid conflict of interest. Question to the Premier. When did you inform the PEI Law Society of the Auditor General's findings on Billy Dow?
Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I have not done so, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Premier. Honourable Member, Georgetown, St. Peter's.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So the Law Society rules also state that members must report conduct that raises a substantial question as to whether another lawyer's honesty of trustworthiness. Mr. Premier, you are the Attorney General of this province by your own admission here today. Why have you failed to report this very serious incident to the Law Society of Prince Edward Island?
Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, as I said previously, we have the management letter from the Auditor General, and we are addressing the issues that she raised there, and I will inform this House when we have reached the point where we are reporting back to the Auditor General and where we are taking steps that flow from that management letter. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Premier. Honourable Member, Georgetown, St. Peter's.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Now, I'm not only talking about your duty here as the Premier of Prince Edward Island and your duty to respond to the Auditor General and to take steps. What I'm talking about here now is the Law Society of Prince Edward Island. You are the Attorney General of Prince Edward Island, so you're really responsible for the goings and comings in that area as it applies to government. I'm not sure why you can't see how you should have taken this directly to the Law Society of Prince Edward Island. The auditor clearly states the conflict. You now clearly know about it, and the bylaws of the Law Society state clearly that you have to report it. Question the Premier: when will you report this to the Law Society of Prince Edward Island, as is your duty?
Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, it's important to look into the full circumstances that are raised by the Auditor General's letter, and that's in fact what we are doing. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Premier. Honourable Member, Georgetown, St. Peters.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So it's my understanding that the Premier himself is a practicing lawyer. If that's the case, he has already broken the Law Society of Prince Edward Island's rules by not reporting it, seeing as he knows about it, as is one of their rules, that he has to report it immediately. Premier, what form of openness do you consider sitting on serious proof uncovered by the Auditor General on government's lawyer acting in conflict?
Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, we're not sitting on it. We have a letter from the management letter from the Auditor General that was conveyed to government precisely as a result of her review, which is why we asked her to review this situation, and we are indeed considering and addressing the issues raised in that management letter. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Premier. Honourable Member, Georgetown, St. Peters, final question.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So I find it very ironic that the Premier will lecture us every day on how things are going to be different under his rule, how things are going to be better under his rule, how he doesn't do business this way. He's breaking the Law Society of Prince Edward Island's rules. He is a practicing lawyer, breaking the rules that says that no practicing lawyer cannot report. So he has to report. It's a duty as a lawyer to report this, the findings of the Auditor General. Not only that, he's the Attorney General of Prince Edward Island and the Premier. You think somebody like that would want way better for Prince Edward Island. You think somebody like that would want to set an example for all islanders that things are going to be cleaned up here in Prince Edward Island. Little wonder people are sick of governments all over the world. You're a prime example of why people are sick of governments. Premier, why are there never any consequences under your rule for senior bureaucrats and government officials and government lawyers who break rules?